So I was scrolling through the newsfeed on PC Gamer last week, and I found something that caught my eye. It was an article about a newly released card game based around World War II era units called Cards. And seeing as one of my biggest passions outside of gaming is history, I decided to give it a shot. Plus, it's not a fantasy-based title in the genre, which isn't something you see every day. I downloaded it on Steam for free, and after 20 hours of playtime later, I feel qualified to give my take on a game which has quite a few interesting additions and alterations to the typical card game formula. Before I get into more specifics about the game, I feel that it is important to note my experience with the online collectible card game genre. I have a lot of experience with Hearthstone, with the vast majority of my games being played during its beta and in the first few years of its public launch. I have gotten back into it recently though, so that I could refresh my memory and compare it to Cards. On top of that, I have also played a bit of some land-based CCGs like Magic the Gathering and Faeria, but I admittedly have had less exposure with those games than compared to Hearthstone. In terms of aesthetics, Cards immerses the player in its World War II era theme with period-accurate cards and music. Each unit card is based on an actual military unit or general that fought in the war. If you are interested in the history behind any of the cards, like I was, you can learn more by reading additional flavor text for each one in the deck builder. Order cards, which function like spells in Hearthstone or Magic, are also themed to iconic aspects of each nation's specific war strategies. The background music that plays while you play games includes songs and anthems from the 30s and 40s, and also changes based on which primary nation your deck is composed of. Being that Hearthstone is the card game that I have the most experience with, and the fact that it's the most popular title in the genre at the moment, I will be breaking down the basics of cards based on similarities and differences with the Warcraft-based card game. As I've already stated, there are a few different types of cards in Cards. Units, or minions from Hearthstone, function as the primary way of dealing damage to the opponent. Spells and secrets are present in the form of orders and countermeasures respectively, and function similarly to remove enemy units or buff your own at key points. Weapon cards and hero powers are not present, while health starts at a baseline of 20, down from Hearthstone's 30. Credits, which are equivalent to mana in Hearthstone, are gained based on turns and orders in a similar fashion, but max out at 12 turns rather than 10. And, as you have probably noticed already, there are unit keywords which give different units unique characteristics. Most of these correspond to keywords from Hearthstone, with Wind Fury being cut in half to save valuable text space, and Guard being the kinder version of Taunt. Now you may be wondering, what are these different types of units that I've been mentioning? Well, in Cards, units are broken up into 5 types to simulate the different characteristics of battlefield units: infantry, tanks, fighters, bombers, and artillery. Infantry and tanks both need to be in the next line over from their opponent to attack them, while fighters, bombers, and artillery can attack units from anywhere on the battlefield. Every unit, except for tanks, can only move or attack every turn, whereas tanks can do both on the same turn. Once again, all units except for bombers and artillery take damage when attacking an opponent, but bombers are the only unit type that does not do damage when defending and can be blocked by fighters, which guard every unit in their row from bombers as a taunt minion in Hearthstone would. The advantages and disadvantages of these units lead to more variety in combat exchanges than any card game that I've played. You might think artillery has the lowest amount of obvious downsides and make a deck featuring a lot of them, but you'd also find out pretty quick that once the enemy takes the front line, your artillery are not going to trade very efficiently, and any more artillery that you put down will be practically helpless without the support of other unit types. Or you might think the ability for tanks to move and attack on the same turn, in combination with their generally high stats, makes them the best unit type, and use a lot of them in your deck. Yet you also have to take into account the cost of using those two movements during the same turn, which is usually higher for tanks. Yes, unlike in most card games, movement and attacks in cards have a direct cost in resources and competes with the same pool used to play cards from your hand. Generally, infantry units have lower action costs than other unit types because they have less inherent advantages, and the more expensive planes and tanks have higher costs because they can end the game in a few turns if the enemy doesn't react in time. This simple change from the normal free attacks once per turn model of card game, in combination with the front line and unit types mechanics, makes Cards a highly tactical and more deliberately paced game than Hearthstone. As a result, the typical game will go for 10 to 20 minutes, as opposed to the 5 to 10 minute average Hearthstone game. Think of it as the Rainbow Six Siege to Hearthstone's Call of Duty. Now, I'm not saying that either is inherently better or more fun, but you have to admit that as Siege has gotten a lot more popular, it has been a refreshing slowing of the pace for shooters, for veterans needing a break from the more intense, more random COD games. Classes in Cards consist of 5 primary nations: the United States, the Soviet Union, Germany, Japan, and Britain, as well as 2 secondary nations, France and Italy. In a similar fashion to color mixing in Magic, after players choose a main nation from one of the 5 primaries to form the basis for their deck, they can also choose an additional nation from one of the other 6 nations to contribute up to 12 cards in a standard 40-card deck. Despite the absence of neutral cards that every country can use as a result, the ability to use these allied nations and decks can be used to surprise opponents and gain the upper hand in a close contest. Say, for example, you are running a US deck built around a lot of strong planes, and your opponent is able to destroy your air force with artillery. They may not be expecting you to drop some Japanese units with the Blitz characteristic next turn, which can allow you to destroy their artillery with ease. There are also plenty of cards that cater towards having certain nations as an ally, like a Soviet plane that is cheaper when French allied units are on the battlefield. A multitude of powerful combinations, pun intended, can be formed by taking cards from different countries and using them together. The ability to mix and match cards from 7 different nations provides a multitude of deck building options that has rarely been featured in card games since the original color mixing system in Magic the Gathering. In tandem with the diversity found in deck building, the unique synergies and counters between each of the 5 unit types, along with requiring resources to move and attack with those units that is shared with playing cards themselves, makes Cards a less RNG-based game than Hearthstone, and yet it is still just as varied. For online collectible card game players who prefer to be more methodical when preparing decks and playing units, Cards' more tactical take on the traditional card game systems offers an alternative to the more mainstream titles in the genre.